Okay, let's unpack this. You're probably noticing things costing more at the grocery store.
Oh, definitely. It's a reality for so many people right now.
Yeah, your budget might be feeling tight.
Yeah.
But while that's happening, consider this. The wealth of the world's absolute top billionaires. It's just exploding.
Right.
We're talking about, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, Elon Musk. Their combined net worth is over $700 billion.
Just those few individuals.
Exactly. And here's something that really paints a picture. The Forbes billionaire list for 2025, it's got a record 15 names on it.
15. Wow.
And just to put that in perspective, back in 2023, there were only 6.
Only 6 just a couple of years ago.
And if you go way back, like 1987, even adjusting for inflation, only 2 people hit that kind of threshold.
2 versus 15 now. That really shows the acceleration, doesn't it? It's not just the wealth, it's how fast it's piling up these days.
Absolutely. And it just makes you wonder, well, how? How is this massive amount of wealth concentrating so incredibly quickly?
Yeah, what are the mechanics behind it?
And what does it actually mean for the economy, for society, maybe even for that idea of a stable middle class we used to talk about?
Mm-hmm.
And, are there ways to maybe address this trend without making mistakes that might have happened in the past?
Complex questions.
Definitely. And that's really the core of what we're diving into today. We're drawing from some really insightful material, including a pretty detailed look at a Cold Fusion YouTube video transcript. It really breaks down this growing wealth gap and sort of the potential consequences.
And right away, you hit this fundamental challenge. How do we even get our heads around the sheer scale of these numbers?
You're so right. Millions, billions, trillions.
Yeah.
They almost become meaningless, just abstract words.
Exactly.
The video we looked at had this brilliant way to make it concrete, though. Imagine you earning $1 every single second, nonstop.
Okay, $1 a second.
To become a millionaire at that rate, it'd take you about 12 days.
12 days. Less than 2 weeks. Okay.
Right. Now, how long to reach $1 billion, earning $1 every second?
A year? 2 years?
Not even close. It would take you over 31 years.
31 years of nonstop earning just to get to 1 billion.
Yes. And remember, these top individuals we mentioned, they aren't just sitting at $1 billion. We're talking tens, sometimes hundreds of billions.
And it's growing fast.
Incredibly fast. In 2024 alone, total billionaire wealth jumped by $2 trillion.
$2 trillion in just 12 months.
In 12 months. And get this, the top 10 wealthiest men saw their fortunes grow, on average, by $100 million per day.
$100 million every single day. That's almost impossible to comprehend.
It really is. That's more than entire communities might earn in, a generation.
So if we connect these astronomical figures to the broader economy, the transcript we reviewed points out something pretty stark.
What's that?
The top 1% has captured about 38% of all new wealth created since 1995.
38%, just for the top 1%.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the poorest half of the entire world's population, that's roughly 3.8 billion people, they own just 2% of global wealth.
2% for half the planet.
Mm.
It's almost hard to visualize that kind of disparity when you lay it out.
It is. And the situation in the U.S. is particularly striking, according to the sources.
Not so.
Well, it indicates that just 3 Americans, Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, actually possess more wealth combined than the entire bottom half of American society.
3 people own more than, what is that, around 70 million people?
Roughly 70 million people, yes. It really forces you to stop and think about the wider implications of that concentration.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, this level of concentration isn't entirely new in history. To understand maybe the significance, the transcript we looked at brings in Ray Dalia's perspective on historical cycles.
Dio, right. What does he suggest?
He points out that historically, when you see these really large gaps in wealth and in people's perceived values, especially when that's combined with significant debt levels and economic downturns, that combination often leads to periods of increased social conflict and, instability, vulnerability.
That makes sense. History repeating itself, potentially. And here's where it gets really interesting for a lot of people listening, I think. The shrinking middle class. It's presented almost as a key symptom of this whole wider problem.
Right.
Think back to, those 80s and 90s TV shows, right? It often seemed like one decent income could support a pretty comfortable family life.
Yeah, that was the common portrayal, definitely.
The transcript suggests that, financially speaking, things were relatively more stable for a lot of people back then, But then, we hit the late 2000s.
Housing crisis.
Exactly, the big crash. Then slower economic growth for years after that. And then, more recently, the government's response to COVID-19.
Massive economic stimulus, money printing.
Right, which, while intended to help, inadvertently fueled a lot of asset inflation stocks. Real estate went way up. But for many, wages felt stagnant, and the cost of living, the stuff you're buying, just soared.
And that's a critical point, isn't it? How interventions designed to stabilize the overall economy can sometimes have these unintended side effects on wealth distribution. They can disproportionately benefit those who already own assets.
Precisely. So, okay, how are these massive fortunes actually being built and, maybe more importantly, maintained at this scale? The transcript kind of breaks it down into three main avenues.
Okay, three routes.
First one, inheritance. And this was actually quite surprising to me. In 2023, more new billionaires inherited their wealth than actually created it from scratch themselves.
More inherited than earned it last year.
Yeah. And get this, every single billionaire under the age of 30, born rich, inherited wealth.
Wow. Every single one under 30.
And a big part of this is that in many places, there's no significant inheritance tax, or it's easy to structure things to avoid it. So these vast fortunes just get passed down generation after generation. You end up with these entrenched wealth dynasties.
That lack of substantial inheritance tax is definitely a key piece of the puzzle. While most people work their whole lives trying to build some financial security.
Right.
These immense fortunes can be transferred largely intact, often without contributing to public services in the same way that, say, income tax or sales tax does.
Okay, so inheritance is number one. The second pathway the transcript highlights is, well, it uses the term corruption and loopholes.
Okay, what does that entail?
It's not always about strictly illegal stuff, apparently. It's more about how the existing financial system itself can sometimes seem rigged, or at least heavily tilted, in favor of those who are already wealthy.
Like the system itself has biases.
Kind of. Think back to the 2008 bailouts. Financial institutions made incredibly risky bets. The whole economy nearly collapsed.
And taxpayers footed the bill?
Exactly. The profits had been privatized for years, but the massive losses were essentially socialized. That's one angle. Then there are the more direct strategies for, let's say, tax avoidance. Things like parking assets in offshore accounts. Or this technique called buy, borrow, die.
Buy, borrow, die. I've heard of that. Can you break it down?
Sure. Edward McCaffrey coined the term, I think. Basically, the super rich hold massive amounts of appreciating assets, like company stock, instead of selling stock and paying capital gains tax or taking a salary and paying income tax.
Right.
They simply borrow money against those assets. They live off the loans.
So they get cash without technically earning taxable income.
Precisely. The transcript uses Larry Ellison as an example, borrowing against his Oracle stock to fund, yachts, private islands, incredibly lavish stuff.
And he just pays relatively low interest on the loans compared to what income tax would be.
Exactly. And then the die part. Upon death, their heirs can often use trusts and other complex financial planning tools to manage or minimize inheritance taxes, sometimes passing the assets on with a step-up in basis, which effectively wipes out the capital gains tax liability for the heir.
So the gains accrued during the original owner's lifetime might never get taxed.
That's the idea. The transcript even mentions a stat that the richest 25 people in the U.S. paid an effective tax rate, like what they actually paid, versus their wealth increase of just 3.4%.
3.4%, that's
Crazy.
Remarkably low compared to average income tax rates.
It really highlights how the current tax structure can actually incentivize borrowing over earning for the ultra-wealthy. It's a fundamentally different relationship with taxation.
Yeah, that buy, borrow, die strategy is a really clear illustration. It shows how the tax system, even if the rules look the same on paper, can work very differently depending on whether your wealth comes from wages or from massive asset holding.
Okay, so inheritance, loopholes. What's the third route?
Monopoly power.
Ah, monopolies. Like the old robber barons.
Sort of the modern equivalent, maybe. The transcript suggests this accounts for nearly 18% of billionaire wealth today.
18% from monopolies.
Yeah. When one company, or maybe just a tiny handful of companies, totally dominates an entire industry.
They can basically set the rules.
Right. They can stifle competition, they can dictate prices for consumers, and they can even hold down wages for workers because, well, where else are you going to work in that sector?
Makes sense. Give me some examples.
Well, think about the Gilded Age steel, oil. Now think tech.
Amazon, Google, Meta.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Amazon's grip on online shopping, Google's dominance in search and online ads, Meta's control over social media platforms. But it's not just tech. The transcript also mentions Aliko Dangote's cement monopoly in Nigeria.
Okay.
And it references accusations leveled against the Adani Group in India concerning market dominance and influence.
So the concern isn't just about prices or wages.
No, it's also that this massive concentration of economic power can easily translate into significant political influence. They can lobby governments, shape regulations in their favor.
Creating a feedback loop almost. More economic power leads to more political power, which protects the economic power.
Precisely. It can become a self-reinforcing cycle.
Now, the transcript also digs into the role of broader financial policies. It mentions something called the Cantillon effect. Am I saying that right?
Cantillon effect, yes. It's a really crucial concept for understanding how inequality can widen, especially when new money is created.
Okay, explain it like I'm 5. Or maybe 10.
Okay, so imagine the government or the central bank injects new money into the economy, maybe to fight a recession.
Right, like printing money or quantitative easing.
Exactly. The Cantillon effect basically says that this new money doesn't spread out evenly and instantly like butter on hot toast.
Okay.
Instead, the people and institutions closest to the money spigot, typically big banks, large corporations, maybe already wealthy investors, they get access to it first.
And what do they do with it?
Well, they can use it to buy assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, and they buy them before the new money has circulated widely enough to push up general prices.
Ah, so they buy assets while they're still relatively cheap.
Exactly. Then, as that money slowly trickles down through the economy into wages and spending for ordinary people.
By then, prices have started to rise.
Right. The cost of groceries, rent, gas, it starts going up because there's more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. So the folks who got the money last, their purchasing power might actually decrease, even if they eventually get a bit more money.
So the early recipients benefit from asset inflation, while the later recipients face price inflation.
That's the core idea. And think about it in the context of government stimulus or quantitative easing during downturns. What often happens?
The stock market goes up, sometimes way up.
Right. And who owns most of the stock? The transcript gives a pretty staggering statistic for 2022. The wealthiest 10% of the population held 93% of all stock market equity.
93%. Owned by the top 10%.
So when policies pump up the stock market, it disproportionately benefits a very small segment of society, widening that wealth gap.
It really underscores that disconnect, doesn't it, between the intention of a policy like stimulating the economy and who actually benefits most from the specific way it's implemented?
Absolutely. It highlights the distributional consequences of monetary policy.
And there was this quote from Gary Stevenson, the former trader. He put it really simply. Money is not food. Money is not energy. Money is not housing.
Yeah, that's a powerful point.
His argument, as presented in the transcript, is that just pumping more money into the system doesn't magically create more stuff, more houses, more energy, more food.
Right. Money is just the claim check. It's not the actual resources.
So if you dramatically increase the number of claim checks, money, without increasing the actual resources, and if you give most of the new claim checks to people who already have tons of them,
then the price of the limited resources just gets bid up. Inflation, and the people with fewer claim checks are worse off.
Exactly. The transcript even suggests that maybe some of the intense inflation we saw after the pandemic stimulus could have been amplified by this effect. The huge increase in the money supply wasn't evenly distributed.
Stevenson's analogy really cuts through the complexity. It reminds us that money is a tool, a medium of exchange, but it's not the same as real tangible wealth or resources. An increase in the money supply without a matching increase in productivity or goods just leads to inflation.
And, understandably, seeing all this play out, stagnant wages for many, soaring costs, and news about billionaire wealth exploding, it leads to frustration, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The transcript mentions this growing sense of bitterness, even anger, that you see expressed online, sometimes in protests, too.
Yeah, people sharing stories about working multiple jobs, harder than ever, and still feeling like they're falling behind or just treading water.
That feeling of economic insecurity, the sense that the system might be rigged, that hard work doesn't guarantee stability or upward mobility anymore, that's a really powerful driver of social discontent. The examples cited people relying heavily on credit just for basics paint a really concerning picture.
So it begs the question, what can actually be done? What are the potential solutions? The transcript touches on several ideas, but it's also quick to point out they're all pretty complex.
No easy answers for sure.
One idea is, naturally, taxing the ultra-rich more progressively. Higher taxes on their income, maybe on their overall wealth or assets.
That's right. The idea being that a larger chunk of that concentrated wealth could fund public services, education, healthcare, infrastructure.
But then there's the immediate counterargument, right? Capital flight.
Exactly. The concern that if taxes get too high in one place, the ultra-wealthy will just move their assets or even themselves to countries or jurisdictions with lower taxes. It's a real challenge for any single country acting alone.
And the transcript also brings up Milton Friedman's argument against, say, a 100% inheritance tax.
Yeah, his point was that if people can't pass on any of their wealth, it might severely discourage them from investing, innovating, and building businesses in the first place. Finding that balance is tricky.
Okay, so taxing wealth is one avenue. What else?
Tightening regulations on the financial sector comes up, specifically addressing some of the loopholes we talked about.
Like the buy, borrow, die strategy.
Potentially closing loopholes related to that, and also practices like companies buying back their own stock.
Stock buybacks. Why are they seen as a problem?
Well, the transcript quotes economist Lenore Palladino. Her view is that massive stock buybacks have become a major driver of economic imbalance.
How so?
The argument is that companies spend billions buying their own shares to artificially boost the stock price and executive bonuses instead of investing that money in R&D, raising worker wages, or lowering prices. It prioritizes short-term shareholder payouts over long-term company health or broader economic benefit.
So less investment, stagnant wages, but higher stock prices benefiting shareholders and execs.
That's the critique. Alongside that, there's talk about closing offshore tax havens, making it harder to hide assets, and addressing creative accounting or capital gains exemptions.
Of course, you always hear the argument about people having a right to their hard-earned money.
True, and that's a valid point in the debate. But the counterpoint focuses on fairness, ensuring the system doesn't have these built-in advantages that allow extreme wealth accumulation while bypassing the tax obligations others face. It's about trying to level the playing field.
Right, leveling the playing field.
The debate around stock buybacks really highlights that tension, doesn't it? The goal of maximizing shareholder value versus the potential impact on wages, investment, and overall economic equality.
Another idea that always comes up is raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, especially when you see this phenomenon of the working poor people working full-time, sometimes more, but still struggling to make ends meet.
But this one also has pushback, right? Concerns about job losses.
Definitely. The counter-arguments are usually that forcing businesses, especially small businesses, to pay higher wages might lead them to hire fewer people, automate jobs, or pass the costs on to consumers through higher prices, potentially fueling inflation.
So it could hurt the very people it's intended to help or have broader negative economic effects.
That's the worry. The transcript is clear. These are all really complex policy choices, and they usually involve trade-offs. There are potential benefits and potential downsides to weigh. Effective implementation is also key.
And Gary Stevenson, the former trader, he brings up another huge factor: politics.
Ah, yes. The political dimension. You can't ignore it.
His point, basically, is that the immense concentration of wealth also translates into immense political power.
Lobbying, campaign donations, funding think tanks, media influence.
Right. He suggests that enacting really meaningful change, the kind that might significantly alter the distribution of wealth or regulate powerful interests, is incredibly difficult. It requires massive, organized public support to counterbalance that entrenched influence.
It's often the biggest hurdle. Even if you have good policy ideas, getting them implemented against powerful opposition is tough.
And he also emphasizes, which makes sense, that there's no single magic bullet solution. What works, or was politically feasible, will probably look different from country to country depending on their specific economic situation, their political system, everything.
Absolutely. Context matters hugely. Solutions need to be tailored.
Finally, the transcript dipped into some comments from the Cold Fusion Instagram community, which were pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, one person asked a question you hear a lot. If a billionaire creates jobs for countless people, then what's wrong with that?
The classic job creator argument.
Exactly. And the response in the transcript was nuanced. It pointed out that actually a lot of the wealth accumulation for today's super rich doesn't necessarily come from building traditional factories or businesses that employ huge numbers of people directly.
More from finance. Investments.
Yeah, more from investments, financial markets, maybe scaling tech platforms that might not be as labor-intensive as old-school industries. It complicates that simple job creator narrative.
That's a fair point. The way wealth is generated has shifted quite a bit.
The transcript also briefly mentioned the example of the Trump tariffs. Not to get into the politics of it, but more as an illustration of how economic policies get viewed through completely different lenses.
How so?
It used Ground News, that aggregator site, to show how different news outlets, left, right, center, framed the tariffs, their impacts, and even the motivations behind them in wildly divergent, often politically charged ways.
Yeah.
There were even questions raised about potential insider trading related to them.
Right. It just shows how economic issues are almost always tangled up with political perspectives and interpretations. It's rarely just about the raw numbers.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, we've really covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We looked at the staggering growth of billionaire wealth recently. The widening wealth gap that you, listening, are probably feeling the effects of in different ways. And we dug into some of the main drivers: inheritance patterns, loopholes baked into the financial system, the growing power of monopolies,
And the unintended consequences of certain financial policies, like that Cantillon effect we discussed.
Right. We also touched on the potential ripple effects, social instability, a struggling middle class, and explored some of the proposed solutions, acknowledging how complex and politically difficult they often are.
I think the central takeaway, really, is that this rapid pileup of wealth at the very, very top isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's not only about individual genius or hard work.
It's connected to the system itself.
Exactly. It's deeply intertwined with systemic factors, the rules of the game, you could say, within our economic and financial structures. And tackling this trend effectively, it probably needs a really comprehensive approach, one that understands all these underlying mechanisms.
So that leads us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about everything we've talked about today, the scale of the gap, the forces driving it, the possible fixes, and their problems. What single area do you personally think holds the most potential, the most promise for actually making a dent in wealth inequality?
Yeah, where's the biggest leverage point?
And just as importantly, what do you see as the biggest roadblocks, the toughest hurdles to making real progress in that specific area? It's definitely something worth